Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Kinzie, and I am joining you from Anchorage, Alaska today. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Strive Group here in Anchorage, and welcome to our daily webinars. Today's topic will be on unemployment, and just to put it all out there, I'm not going to get too overly specific with this topic today. I'm trying to make sure that the content I can provide to you is good enough for all 50 of our states, as opposed to just offering specific content on Alaska. For those of you in Alaska, next week I'm going to have someone from our State of Alaska Unemployment Insurance Division specifically talking about how Alaska's process is working, but today's process is more generalized, so anybody around the country can benefit from it. As I said earlier, we do daily webinars. Monday's session is going to be about communication cues in a virtual environment. Tuesday's session will be about psychological safety, and so on and so forth. We're trying to make sure that our content every day is beneficial, not just to business owners and business leaders, but to anybody working or not working, as today's content should help with, but anybody that is in the workforce that is trying to manage this disruption. Little bit of housekeeping before I dive into my content. The chat pod on the right-hand side, if you're joining us live, there's a chat pod on the right-hand side, and feel free to text in or type in questions for me as I go throughout the content. If it comes up to the 11 o'clock hour, I might not be able to have time to get to your questions, so make sure that I've got your address, your email address, and I'll just try to respond to you directly, or I will put you in touch with someone who can respond to you directly regarding that question. If you want to visit our website after this recording at thestrivegroup.com, you'll see not only a recording of today's session, but of all previous recordings, as well as the future programming for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so on and so forth. So again, my name is Heather Kinzie. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Strive Group. Today's topic is on the unemployment process, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. Unemployment is a federal program, but it's funded through the states. So what that means is that all 50 of our states are going to be managing this program, or this entitlement, if you will, differently. And I know that entitlement's not exactly the right word, but just bear with me on this. Each state will manage this benefit slightly differently. And what that means is that if you've got a cousin in Alabama and then another one in Ohio, and you're sitting up in the Pacific Northwest, their program and their benefit amount is not going to be like yours. And so try very hard to not compare yourself to someone in a different state. And later on, I'll tell you, try not to even compare yourself to your neighbor, because while they may be working under the same state process, their weekly benefit amounts are going to be slightly different based on what they've put into it. Each state's legislative and executive branch determine the amount and the eligibility requirements for unemployment benefits. So again, you can't compare yourself to someone in Ohio or someone in Minnesota or someone in New York, because their legislative and executive branch have determined the process might be slightly different, the eligibility requirements, the monetary amounts, they have discretion. And so those states are likely to be very, very different from your own state. The benefit amounts are also likely to vary from one state to one state. However, the process itself, the overarching processes, are likely to be similar. So that's where you're going to see some commonalities with your cousin in Arkansas or your cousin in Minnesota, but the benefits and the eligibility requirements are likely to be different. So what I have found as I've helped people through the unemployment processes, either because those employers have contracted with someone like me or my firm to help people through a transition, or just through working with my network. And, you know, I've got people in my network that work for these government agencies. What I found is that their jargon is a tad bit confusing. And so I've got 3 slides specific to 3 terms that for the most part, everybody across all 50 states, all those government agencies are going to be using. But they're not terms that regular people like you and I use, and so they have a tendency to be, kind of, I don't know, kind of throwing us for a loop. And the first term is base period. And a lot of people think this is just your yearly earnings, but that is a myth. It's not necessarily your yearly earnings. It really depends on when you open a claim for unemployment. And so if you think about the typical base period, not the anomaly, but the typical base period, it's a 1-year time span consisting of the earliest 4 of the 5 most recent completed calendar quarters. So how's that for a mouthful? But let's just think about it logically. So right now we are in April. The most recent fully completed calendar quarter is January through March for us, right? That is the most recent fully completed calendar quarter. But for unemployment purposes, you look at the earliest 4 of the last 5. And so technically January through March mean nothing for the typical claimant. What you have to do is you have to look at the 4 calendar quarters that were previous to January through March in our particular situation right now, because we're smack dab in the middle of April. And so it just so happens to be that if you look at it that way, we're looking at the full calendar year of 2019, right? But trust me, that's just a coincidence, because most claimants right now, typical claimants, are filing in April. So January through March is the most recent, but you have to look back to all 5, which puts us January through December of last year. But you can imagine that base period, because it rotates, you can imagine that starts to look really confusing for the claimant that's filing a claim in June, or a claimant that's filing a claim in November. We're no longer at sort of a typical, or a full calendar year. It just so happens to be, because we're in April right now, that if we do a typical base period, we're looking at a full calendar year in 2019. Some states can use alternate base periods that include the most recent calendar quarters. So in that case, if a state is making an exception, it would be January through March of 2020, and then the last 3 calendar quarters of 2019. But again, that's an exception to the rule. So that's very, very important to note. And another exception to the rule is some claimants have really good reasons that they should be entitled to an extended base period. So we're looking outside of the typical 4 or 5 calendar quarters, but they have a really good reason, either through sickness or through disability or through other reasons, to extend their base period. Those are the true anomalies in the system. And if you're watching this recording, or you're joining us live today, know that it is not likely you will have such a special exception. It is likely that you will be in the typical base period. The next term that is often confusing is your weekly benefit amount. There's lots of things that are confusing about a weekly benefit amount, but the biggest one is that a lot of claimants think that their weekly benefit amount is the full amount that they'll get every single week. And that is not true. A weekly benefit amount, or otherwise known as the WBA, it is an up to amount. So it is a maximum amount depending upon what you put into the system during your base period, and it is dependent upon what you earned in the week that you're filing, right? So the previous week that you're filing for. And I'll get into the weekly certifications in just a minute, so just bear with me. But keep in mind, as I said earlier, every state is different. Their legislative and their executive branch have worked together to identify what the unemployment benefit for their state may be. And we are looking at a huge variance here. The average across all of our states is a WBA of $378. But if you look at the variance, you'll see just how different you may be from your bordering state neighbors. Mississippi is currently at the lowest WBA at $213 per week, whereas Massachusetts is currently at our highest WBA at $555 per week. So that variance, as you can see right there, is just absolutely humongous. And every state, of course, is going to be different. But again, the myth is that if you qualify for unemployment, you get the full WBA. And that's not the case. It is dependent upon what you put into the system during your base period and what you worked in the week that you're filing for. Okay, so just because you live in Massachusetts doesn't mean that you're going to get that full $555. It means that that is an up to amount. That is the maximum amount that you can get. But it's quite possibly that you're currently in Massachusetts and you're only eligible to receive maybe $375. And so if that is your assigned WBA, even that is an up to amount. Because if you worked a little bit the previous week, that maximum benefit that you've been assigned in this hypothetical situation, $350 or $370, that might be even further reduced based on the next term that we'll talk about, your excess earnings. This is a term that is so easily confused because here we have a claimant who has been assigned a weekly benefit amount, and maybe it's $350 a week or $412 a week. And that claimant thinks, well, shoot, I can't live on that, right? I have to support my family, I have to pay my rent, or whatever the case may be. And so that claimant picks up a side hustle, right? And I would too. If I looked at my state benefit, because in Alaska, it's $370 a week. And I would look at that benefit and I'm like, I can't pay my rent with $370 a week. So I'm going to pick up a side hustle. But that's known as excess earnings. And so every state is very slightly on how they calculate or how they manage excess earnings. But this is the way it works. So a claimant gets assigned their WBA. And again, for this hypothetical situation, let's just say it's $415, right? So this claimant gets assigned a WBA of an up to amount, right? A WBA, an up to amount of $415. And so I think I can't pay my rent on that, and so I need a side hustle. And so I pick up a side hustle, maybe a part-time job or a temporary job, or I do some work for Lyft or Uber or something like that. But if I am not cognizant of my excess earnings amount, then what I could be doing is I could be disqualifying myself from this 415. Because if I work more than my excess earnings amount allows me to work, then I disqualify myself from the state benefit. And that's what excess earnings means. It refers to the amount of money you may earn in any given claiming week and not affect your WBA. So I hope that makes sense for everybody. And again, every state calculates this somewhat differently. So I'm going to back up to this WBA amount. If a claimant has a WBA amount of, let's say, $415, depending upon where that claimant lives, the excess earnings amount is going to be calculated based on that WBA. So let's say hypothetically that my excess earnings amount was, I don't know, $500. Because of the way my state calculates my excess earning, if my WBA, my weekly benefit amount, is $415, let's say there's this funky calculation that now my excess earnings amount, let's say it's $500. What that means is I cannot work more than $500 on any given filing week. Or if I do work more than that amount, I disqualify myself from my WBA altogether. And so that's really important for claimants to know, is they have to know their WBA because that calculates their excess earnings, and then they'll know just how much of a side hustle they can have without disqualifying themselves from the benefit. The last thing that I'm going to talk about before I'm going to jump into process is this CARES Act. It's been in the news, and unless you're living under a rock, you know that the CARES Act provides a stimulus to unemployment. And what that means is, in this particular case for unemployment benefits, is the CARES Act has loosened up some typical eligibility requirements. It also has extended the duration of unemployment, because again, every state has a limit on how long you can claim unemployment. So the CARES Act has extended those typical durations. The CARES Act has also given states the opportunity to waive their waiting weeks. Most states will have a waiting week that you have to wait before benefits kick in. But the CARES Act says, no, these benefits or states have the right to waive that benefit week, or that waiting week, sorry. The program also offers what's known as the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation Benefit. And that is, I refer it to it as the $600 add-on. So the CARES Act has added on a $600 amount to any benefit you would otherwise be receiving from your state's package. Okay, and then the last thing that the CARES package did is that it extended both state unemployment benefits, so that WBA that I was talking about, it extended a similar benefit, or it created a similar benefit as to the WBA for sole proprietors and gig workers, etc. But it also extended the FPUC to sole proprietors and contractors. And so this is a huge game changer for sole proprietors, because they've never been able to take advantage of unemployment processes and benefits because they didn't put into the system as a typical employee had done for years and years and years. But that's another webinar for another time, and I'm not going to try to explain that now. We are having a webinar specifically for sole proprietors next week, but I can't talk about it right now. So I understand that there's a question, so please bear with me while I glance down, okay? The question is the employee responsible for contributing to the base period, or will the employer contribute to the base period? Okay, this is a fantastic question, and it probably stemmed from my inability to explain it correctly on the slide. So bear with me here. Let's go back to the very, very first slide. Unemployment is funded by the employer. That's worth repeating. Unemployment is funded by the employer. So when an employee works for an employer, that employer submits monies to the unemployment system on that employee's behalf, right? So that's all done through tax processes and all of that. I don't need to explain how complicated that might be. Any payroll person would know it, but it is funded by the employer. But here is the kicker. If you are watching this webinar right now and you had been working for an employer during your base period that was paying you under the table, then your employer was not putting into the system. Okay, and I'm sorry for you, because that means that you are now a victim and you do not qualify for unemployment. And that is because your employer was not putting into the system. Okay, another caveat to that is, let's say that you didn't work a lot during the four most recent, or the four earliest of the 5 most recent calendar quarters, right? Let's say that you didn't work a lot. Maybe you only worked part-time, or maybe you only worked temporary work here and there. Your weekly benefit amount may be very, very small, or you may not qualify for benefits at all because you simply didn't put enough into the system as an employee in all of those odd jobs. Because the employer has to put in money into the system. If you didn't work for an employer, but a couple weeks here or a couple of days there or something like that, then you won't have any money, any significant amount of money tied to you or associated with you, perhaps is the better word, during that base period. And so that's just really important to understand. And another thing is that if you've just recently entered the workforce, then you wouldn't have enough money in your base period to make you qualifying for unemployment. And so I'm sorry for you because you're falling out of sort of the typical system, if that's the case for you. But that's the way the unemployment process works. And unfortunately, that just makes you a victim for this particular benefit, okay? So I'm gonna try to head back to the content. The process for all states is fairly simplistic. Now that doesn't mean that I mean it's simple, okay? Because I know that high stress levels, or I know that the complex jargon and terminology is anything but simple. But I hope that knowing how this process is really just a 4-step process, and I hope that me encouraging you to understand that you can get through this 4-step process, hopefully that'll relieve a little bit of the stress, and you'll be able to better absorb the jargon and the specificities that your state then, of course, add to the process. So that being said, that's my hope, and here's the process. You open a claim. Right now, for the majority of claimants, we are opening a claim because we've just learned that we're going to be furloughed, or we just learned that we are furloughed, or we've just learned that we've been laid off, or we've just learned that our hours have gone from 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week down to 10, or down to 20, or down to 5, right? So there has been a massive disruption to our mindset because we've just been notified by our employer that our job is changing. At that point, open a claim, okay? Every state prior to COVID has asked that you respect the process and you respect the way things work, and you open a claim when you know you're unemployed. But I am telling you right now, with COVID, let us just be counted the moment we hear from our employer that our job is changing. Let's open a claim. We may not be suffering right now, right? Maybe our employer told us that our hours won't drop until next week, but let's at least open a claim today to get the hard stuff out of the way, because most of the hard stuff comes in that very first arrow, right? That very first step. So let's do that the moment we learn that our job is changing. What that does is that spurs on communication from the state to us, right? From our unemployment insurance people to us. We open a claim, and then the system sends us a notification via email, or maybe we get something in the mail, or maybe we get a phone call from a claimant, right? Every state is going to be different, the way they process to validate an open claim. But once we file an open claim, we then get notified by a state government official about what our WBA is, or maybe they give us a handbook to help us determine some slots that we've missed, that we didn't fill out correctly, or whatever the case may be. But now we have open communication with the unemployment insurance office, right? Once we start to suffer, meaning that we're no longer in full-time work, right? Because of COVID, we're no longer working in the jobs that we used to enjoy full-time work in, then we file what's known as certifications, weekly certifications. Some states are still doing semi-monthly certifications. Most states are doing weekly certifications at this point. But we start to file weekly certifications. And what you need to know for this is it's a look back. So we don't file, if we suffer next week, Monday through Friday, because our employer took us down to part-time next week, we don't file a weekly certification on Monday. We have to wait until that week passes and we look back, because that's called a look back, right? So last week I suffered, so I'm going to file a weekly certification this week. That's the way that works, right? So we can open a claim today because we know that we will be suffering, but we don't file a weekly certification until looking back, we have suffered for a week, right? So that's how that works. And then once that weekly certification is filed, then a benefit is issued. So pardon me while I look down at my phone again, because I think we have a question. I apologize that I'm looking down at my phone, but I'm self-moderating today. So if my company is open for business, but I am afraid of working because I have an underlying heart issue, can I still file a claim for unemployment? That is a very, very good question. And so let's look at this process, right? The claim is open. So in this case, this person would say, my business is still open, but I am a vulnerable population and hence I cannot go to work, right? So I'm opening a claim, I'm alerting my state government, I am here, pay attention to me, help me through this process, right? That's why we open a claim, because I am a vulnerable person, I cannot report to work, or I should not be reporting to work, okay? So again, every state is different. That state may ask a couple of questions of that person. You know, maybe, you know, tell me a little bit more about why you can't report to work. Tell me a little bit more why you can't telework, right? You can't work from home. So the state has the right to ask those questions to determine eligibility, right? But if it is determined that that person would be eligible because telework is not available and because he or she is in a vulnerable position and shouldn't be reporting to a public office, right, an open to the public space, then he or she would then file weekly certifications after, you know, again, looking back, I suffered last week. I did not work full-time last week, and weekly certifications can begin. So I hope that that answered the question. And I know we're coming up on time. Please bear with me here. I don't want to just cut it off just because we're reaching 11 o'clock. So please just bear with me. I have just a few more things. So one of the things that I wanted to point out about this process is we are not in regular times, right? We are in the middle of a very, very unique and unusual situation. And so that being said, I want to put some caveats to this simplistic four-step process, right? Typically, a claimant opens a claim, right? They've been laid off or they lost their job because it's seasonal or whatever, but we are not typical, right? That's why I'm suggesting open a claim today. If you learn that you could be affected, open a claim today, get the hard part out of the way. Even if the system, the online system tells you you are ineligible, keep working through the process, because it very well could be that your system, your state in Ohio or Texas or Utah or wherever the case may be, it could be that their system has not yet been programmed to accept COVID unemployment issues, right? So don't give up. The second thing is this information is sent to the claimant. And sometimes it takes a few days to get that information, right? Most states are still dealing with the United States Postal Service, right? So that's a 2 or 3 day delay. Right now, we're kind of panicking because we're in the midst of this very, very unique and unusual situation, and we're worried. But just breathe in and breathe out. If they're using U.S. Postal Service, it's going to be 2 or 3 days before you get this hard copy packet in the mail, right? Even if they're using email, it very well could be that their state programming is still February programming, right? Which is pre-COVID. And so it could very well be that you get this email notification that doesn't make any sense to you based on what you just learned today. Be patient with that process because their systems are still catching up, right? And also those terms that you're going to get in your hard copy packet, in your claimant handbook. I've got a claimant handbook right now here. It's like an 18-page claimant handbook for a random state. That's a really overwhelming PDF or document that you'll get. Just breathe in and breathe out and read it. Pay attention to the glossary of terms. Pay attention to things like WBA, excess earnings, base period. Go back to this webinar to see what those things mean in layman's terms, or look it up, Google it. A lot of Google sites or a lot of sites right now are kind of breaking down unemployment. So don't be overwhelmed by all of the paperwork. Just work through it methodically. The next thing is this weekly certification. I encourage people to pay very close attention to their excess earnings amount, because what I would hate to hear about is that you're trying your best on these side hustles, but if you add up all of these side hustles, you may disqualify yourself from the state benefit. And if you disqualify yourself from the state benefit, you're inadvertently disqualifying yourself from that FPUC, which is the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation, that $600 add-on. And I am not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that you work the system, but I also don't want you to think that that $600 is coming to you automatically, because it's not. If you work in excess of your excess earnings amount, not only are you disqualifying yourself from your state benefit, but you're also disqualifying yourself from the FPUC. And if you had relied upon that money, or you had planned for having that $600 add-on, then you're going to be disappointed. And so just be really, really cognizant about what that excess earnings amount is, so you can be better prepared. And then the last thing is that benefits may be delayed, but that's only because our systems are overwhelmed right now. That doesn't mean that your benefit is not going to come. Every state benefit, as well as the FPUC, is a retroactive benefit, meaning that it may be late, but better late than never. All right? So just keep that in mind. And you may be late filing, by the way. You may be 2 weeks into it and you finally get around to opening a claim and filing your weekly certifications. It doesn't mean that you've lost. It just means that you're delayed. All right? So what I'll leave you here today, before I check my phone for one last thing to see if we have any questions, is if you learn that you are going to drop down to less than full time, know that you are worthy, right? You may not be worthy for a huge benefit, but you are worthy to be counted as someone who is suffering. So open a claim, okay? It may not end up in anything worth your while. Okay, I'm not going to lie to you. If you're working 3/4 time, you may not qualify. But my goodness, if you're working down part-time, or you're working at 1/4 time, you're probably going to qualify even for a meager benefit, and it is going to be worth it. Okay, it's just a process that you'll need to get through. Please pay attention to words. I used to work for government. I understand how easy it is for a government official to use jargon, because I've been there. Shoot, I'm a consultant and I use jargon, and shame on me. I need to be very much aware about the words that come out of my mouth and the words that I put on paper for my clients. But right now, UI is doing the best that they can, and they're probably giving you a bunch of jargon. They don't do it to patronize you or to condescend. They do it because that's the language they know. So you need to pay attention to that jargon and either look it up, refer back to this webinar, or look at the glossary of terms, or hop on the phone or hop on their online chats if they have them and ask them to explain that jargon to you. There is absolutely no shame in not knowing their language, okay? So pay attention to words and make sure that you understand what they mean before you just nod your head and get to the next step, okay? The next thing, and I've already said it once, so I won't belabor it, is be patient. Our unemployment offices right now are struggling. They have hired temporary workers to try to handle the phones, and they're trying to backfill, like to back train them to bring those temporary workers up to speed. It is likely that they will be making mistakes. It is likely that there are big wait times. It is likely that there will be some missteps along the way. And so I ask that you exercise patience with your government officials, and hopefully they will exercise patience with you. And as a caveat, I just want to add this. If English is your second language, or your third language, or your fifth language, please know that almost every single state has an interpretation service, an interpretive service. And so it just takes a little bit more time. They're going to ask you what language you would prefer to interact with them with. They're going to hop on their interpretation services and find someone, hopefully, that has that language. And while you're on hold, and then they're going to hop back on. And this would work with both with chat, online chats, as well as on the phone. So please don't get discouraged if English is not your primary or it's not a fantastic language for you, because almost every single state will find a way to help you, and there's absolutely no shame in it, so please don't forget to ask, okay? And then the last thing that I'll leave you with today before I refer to questions is know that unemployment insurance, UI, as I've referred to it, is a temporary benefit. It is a until then resource, until you return to full-time work, until you return to work that is as good as it was during your base period, and so on and so forth. It is not meant to be the resource that you rely upon while you're at home, and other work is available to you. A lot of people do manipulate the system and they take advantage of the system, and that's unfortunate because it leaves a stigma or is that the right word? It's on the tip of my tongue, but it leads a lot of us to have a bad taste in our mouth about people that are claimants, good claimants in the system. But don't let that discourage you from filing an unemployment claim. But also know that when you are able, get off this system, return to work as normal. Okay, so let me just refer again down if there's any questions. Is the employee responsible for contributing? I already answered that one. If I'm afraid of working because of a vulnerable situation, I've already asked that one. What do I do if English is not my greatest language? Inadvertently I answered that one, and I think that's it. So I would ask, well, one, thank you for joining me even though we went over the time. I appreciate your time. Hope you appreciate mine. Tune in to thestrivegroup.com. If you hit our COVID resources, you can tune in for all of our future programming. We offer these Monday through Friday. If you have an idea of future webinars, you can email me directly, that info@thestrivegroup.com. That comes directly to my in-basket, and I'm happy to reach out to my network and find an expert that can create a webinar just for you. And then I would just encourage you to stay positive. These are, as I said, at least 3 or 4 times, very, very unique and unusual times. All of us are struggling, whether we're employed or otherwise. We are stressed out, and we need to rely upon our neighbors and our colleagues and our leaders and our family for support during this time. So let's lean on each other and let's encourage each other to stay positive and mind the gap, find the silver lining, and all of that. So again, I thank you for your time today. I apologize for going over. This is me, this is my firm, this is my contact information. Feel free to contact me directly if you'd like. I'm happy to help in any way I can, or I'm happy to connect you with a resource that would probably do a better job than me. So with that, I will bid you farewell. I appreciate you sharing our webinars with others, or coming back and visiting us again sometime soon. All right. Well, enjoy your day and enjoy your upcoming weekend. Stay safe, wash your hands, keep your